year's commemoration of the life and legacy of Dr. King is centered around his final book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos, Our Community. Written nearly 60 years ago, following the major events and developments of the 1950s and 60s civil rights movement, King's critique of national and global problems remains as relevant today as in his time. This book is particularly important in the present moment, considering the recent turn in our country towards authoritarianism, nationalism, and what Dr. King described as the triple evils of racism, poverty, and militarism. The evening's program features Dr. Hasan Kwame Jeffries, a nationally recognized historian and Morehouse graduate, I should say, class of 1994, who is an expert on the civil rights movement as well as how we as educators teach the movement to a younger generation. Following Dr. Jeffries' presentation here at the podium, he will be joined on the stage by another expert in this field, Dr. David Wall Rice, professor of psychology and director of Crown Forum and Integrated Learning here at Morehouse College. Crown Forum is a weekly college-wide convocation and it's a requirement of all Morehouse students. Following their exchange, we will have some time for your questions. You can see microphones here in the aisle. And again, I just welcome you here this evening. We're so glad to see you. And now I would like to bring to the stage our Dean of Humanities, Social Sciences, Arts, Dr. Regine.
Thank you so much. And I would just really want to thank Dr. Crawford, who is not only the director of the King Papers collection, but she is the endowed professor of history and Africana studies here at Morehouse, doing so much for us behind the scenes to make all of the programming around the King Papers possible. So thank you, Dr. Crawford. Just wanted to say welcome. Welcome on behalf of the Office of the Provost and Academic Affairs. Again, my name is Regine Jackson. I'm the Dean of Humanities, Social Sciences, Media, and Arts, and also Professor of Sociology. When Dr. Crawford asked if I would give just a few words of welcome to mark the occasion and to thank Dr. Jeffries for joining us today, you know, of course, I said absolutely. Whenever she asks, I try to say yes. But in the last couple days, I have to be honest, I've been really reflecting on how much we need to hear this message that Dr. Jeffries brings to us today. I don't know, I'm a sociologist, not a historian, so I'll probably botch the chronology a bit. But it took so long to get a national holiday recognized after Dr. Martin Luther King. It wasn't an automatic sort of victory. It was initially proposed right after his assassination, his death in 1968, and did not come to be until 15, maybe even 17 years later. And even after that, it wasn't recognized by all 50 states for another 17 years. And so while we're reflecting on where do we go from here, I think it's really important to look back and to think, you know, to recognize we've engaged in these kinds of struggles before, and in honor of what Dr. King stood for and hopefully what we will hear from Dr. Jeffries. So welcome to this commemorative event. I'm glad to see so many students and faculty and staff present. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Roland Jackson Jr., and I'm a graduating senior, political science major, international studies minor student on the pre-law track from St. Louis, Missouri. And this year, I humbly serve as the 93rd president of the Morehouse College Student Government Association. I come today to bring greetings on behalf of the SGA and the 93rd Visionary Administration. I want to thank Dr. Vicki Crawford for her tireless work in ensuring that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is not only honored on his birthday, January 15th, but honored each and every day that we walk on this earth, especially at the campus of Morehouse College, which is the home of the world-renowned King Collection, which can be viewed in the Robert Woodruff Library. As a Martin Luther King Jr. Legacy Scholar alumni, I have seen firsthand how his legacy has impacted not only the world, but more specifically, the Morehouse community as a whole. Please, students, staff, faculty, parents, please take time to view these documents and artifacts and learn from the architect of the civil rights movement and a man dedicated to the true movement right here on campus. I would also like to thank Dr. Hasan Jeffries for attending and gracing the campus and the world of academia with your knowledge. It is important, now more than ever, and I truly understand as a political science major, to understand truly where we need to go from here. I always grew up learning that if we do not understand our history, we are bound to repeat it. Thank you all for attending tonight and enjoy the conversation.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Isaac Horn. I am a freshman business administration major from Hampton, Virginia, and I have the honor of introducing our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Hasan Jeffries. Dr. Jeffries teaches, researches, and writes about the African American experience from a historical perspective. He's chronicled the civil rights movement in the 10-episode Audible original series, Great Figures of the Civil Rights Movement, and has told the remarkable story of the original Black Panther Party and the bloody Lowndes, civil rights and Black power in Alabama's Black Belt, which has been praised as the book the historians for the Black freedom movement have been waiting for. Dr. Hasan has collaborated on several public history projects, including serving as the lead scholar and primary scriptwriter for the $27 million redesign of the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee, the site of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He currently serves as the chairperson of the board of directors of the Montpelier Foundation, which stewards the Virginia estate of James Madison, the fourth president of the United States and the architect of the Constitution. Dr. Hasan regularly shares his experience on African American history and contemporary Black politics through public lectures, op-eds, and interviews with print, radio, and television news outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, NPR, CNN, and MSNBC. He has also contributed to several documentary film projects as a historical advisor and featured on-camera scholar, including the 2023 documentaries Fight the Power, How Hip-Hop Changed the World by PBS, and Lowndes County and the Road to Black Power on NBC and Peacock, and his 2020 TEDx talk, Why We Must Confront the Painful Parts of U.S. History, has been viewed more than 2 million times. For his public history work, the King's Art Center in Columbus, Ohio, honored him with the 2023 Legacy and Legends Award. Dr. Hasan's commitment to teaching what he calls hard history led him to edit Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement, a collection of essays by leading civil rights scholars and teachers that explores how to teach civil rights history accurately and effectively, and to host the podcast Teaching Hard History, a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center's Learning for Justice Division. Dr. Hasan also helps school districts to develop anti-racism programming and culturally responsive curricular content centered on social studies by conducting professional development workshops for teachers and administrators. A College of Arts and Sciences alumni, associate professor in the Department of History at the Ohio State University, Dr. Hasan takes great pride in opening students' minds to new ways of understanding the past and the present. For his pedagogical creativity and effectiveness, he has received numerous awards, including Ohio State's highest commendation for teaching, the Ohio State Alumni Award for Distinguished Teaching. Born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, Dr. Hasan graduated from Morehouse College in 1994 with a Bachelor of Arts in History and earned his Ph.D. in American History with a specialization in African American History from Duke University in 2002. Now please welcome to the stage Dr. Jeffries.
To Dr. Crawford, Dean Jackson, Mr. Horn, distinguished and honored guests, faculty, students, friends, and to all those who believe in freedom, good evening. It is good to be home. Amen. I was a young 17-year-old Brooklynite, thought I knew everything about the world, and Morehouse College took a chance on me, and so it's good to be home. in the presence of friends, in the presence of classmates, in the presence of fraternity brothers, line brothers, Kappa Alpha Psi, new brothers as well. So I do not take this opportunity to be here lightly. Not only because of my ties and connections to Morehouse, but also because of the times in which we live. Because of the times in which we live. I've been thinking a lot lately about this idea of where do we go from here. And in thinking about where do we go from here, I of course have to think about what do we mean by here? What is here? Where are we? And as I have been thinking about where here is, I've been having this sense of familiarity, this sense that here, a sense that we've been here before. And as a historian, I began to pull books off of my shelves and thumb through the sages who have documented our past. And I realized, yes, indeed, we have been here before. I am not a poet. I do not aspire to be a poet, but I appreciate poetry. And if you will indulge me for one moment, I want to share with you a poem, not one that I wrote, so you're okay, but a poem that talks about here, the here we find ourselves today. And it was a poem written by Langston Hughes. Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain, seeking a home where he himself is free. America never was America to me. Let America be the dream the dreamers dreamed. Let it be that great, strong land of love where never kings connive nor tyrants scheme, that any man crushed by one above. It never was America to me. Oh, let my land be a land where liberty is crowned with no false patriotic wreath, but opportunity is real and life is free. Equality is in the air we breathe. There's never been equality for me, nor freedom in this homeland of the free. Say, who are you that mumbles in the dark? And who are you that draws your veil across the stars? I am the poor white, fooled and pushed apart. I am the Negro, bearing slavery's scars. I am the red man driven from the land. I am the immigrant, clutching the hope I seek and finding only the same old stupid plan of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak. I am the young man, full of strength and hope, tangled in that ancient endless chain of profit, power, gain, of grab the land, of grab the gold, of grab the ways of satisfying need, of work the men, of take the pay, of owning everything for one's own greed. I am the farmer, the bondsman to the soil. I am the worker sold to the machine. I am the Negro, servant to you all. I am the people, humble, hungry, mean. Hungry yet today despite the dream. Beaten yet today. Oh, pioneers. I am the man who never got ahead. The poorest worker, bartered through the years. Yet, I am the one who dreamt our basic dream in the old world, while still a serf to kings, who dreamt a dream so strong, so brave, so true, that even yet its mighty daring sings. In every brick and stone, in every furrow turned, that's made America the land it has become. Oh, I'm the man who sailed those early seas in search of what I meant to be my home. For I'm the one who left dark Ireland's shores and Poland's plain and England's grassy lea, and torn from black Africa's strand, I came to build a homeland of the free. The free? Who said the free? Not me. Surely not me. The millions on relief today, the millions shot down when we strike, the millions who have nothing for our pay, for all the dreams we've dreamed, and all the songs we've sung, and all the hopes we've held, and all the flags we've hung, the millions who have nothing for our pay, except the dream that's almost dead today. No, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet, and yet must be. The land where every person is free. The land that's mine, the poor man's, Indians, Negroes, me, who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain must bring back our mighty dream again. Sure, call me any ugly name you choose. The steel of freedom does not stain from those who live like leeches on the people's lives, who must take back our land again. America. Oh, yes, I say it plain. America never was America to me. And yet I swear this oath, America will be. Out of the rack and ruin of our gangster death, the rape and rot of graft and stealth and lies, we the people must redeem the land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains, and the endless plain, all the stretch of these great green states, and make America again. Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes penned those words in 1936. And no truer words could be spoken about today than those. Langston Hughes is talking about two Americas, one that is rooted in fact and one that is rooted in fiction. Two Americas that coexist side by side. The question then becomes, how can these two Americas, one rooted in fact and one rooted in fiction, coexist side by side? Well, the truth is, because we as Americans, we hate history. We hate history. What we love is nostalgia. We hate history. We hate stories about the past that make us feel uncomfortable in the present. And we love stories about the past that make us feel comfortable in the present. That's nostalgia, whether it's true or false. I learned that from a literary performer, Reggie Gibson. We hate history but we love nostalgia. Yes, we've been here before. The Spanish-born philosopher George Santayana said those who can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. We've heard that here today, and that's familiar, but we have to dig a little deeper. Because it's not simply that if we don't remember the past, we will repeat it. That's actually giving us too much credit for having overcome the things in the past that create inequality in the present. The problem of not remembering the past is not that we will repeat it. The problem is if we don't remember the past, the way it happened, then we will continue to do the things that we've never stopped doing. We will continue to do the things that have created inequality in the past. We're giving ourselves too much credit if we're saying we're in danger of repeating the past. When did we stop doing the things that have created inequality in the present? And some will say, well, we ended slavery. We did, but we didn't end capitalism and white supremacy. But we ended Jim Crow. We did, but we didn't end capitalism and white supremacy. We ended mass incarceration. No, we didn't. We're here because we never left. We're in this place. We find ourselves in this place because we never left. When we think about specifically the most recent presidential election, it's clear that there are really only two Trump voters. Those who are animated by his racism and his hate, and those who are okay with it. Those who don't mind it. Those who are more interested in tax cuts than the harm that he can do. So we're here not because of the price of eggs. We're here because if Donald Trump, President of the United States, doesn't know anything else, he knows that racism is the most powerful political tool that America has ever created. And he is skilled at deploying it. In talking to some folk about, so how did we get here, and the centrality of racism and white supremacy and getting us to this position. Had a fellow recently, white guy, good white guy, there's some good white people, good white guy. He says, but Dr. Jeffries, if you're saying there is this continuum from the past to the present, and we haven't stopped doing the things in the past that create inequality in the present, how do you explain the election of Barack Obama? Not once, but twice. And the answer to that only became clear to me after Donald Trump was elected. And the reason why Barack Obama won is because his opponents, John McCain and Mitt Romney, were not racist enough. We're not racist enough. Some of you who are students now will be too young to remember when John McCain in 2008 was questioned in a debate about Barack Obama's religious background. And isn't he a Muslim? And obviously there's nothing wrong with being that, but it was this way to demean, to call him out, to identify him by sort of race and religion. It was fear and hate. And John McCain was like, no, we're not going to do that. For all of their policy shortcomings that I would critique, I give them credit for not deploying race and racism as their principal organizing tool. They literally were not racist enough. There's only those two types of Trump voters. Those who are okay with the racism and those who are animated by it. in that moment, those two candidates were not animating the racism, the white supremacy that infects our society. And so that's what Donald Trump leaned into. We are burdened. We are burdened by several myths in about America's past. And one of those myths is the myth of perpetual racial progress. This idea that things have been bad in the past, but they always get better. And so we tell ourselves this story of perpetual progress. We go from Frederick Douglass to Dr. King. We go from Dr. King to Barack Obama. We go from Barack Obama to Beyonce, who's singing country music. Things always get better. Perpetual progress. But the reality is, when we look at the ways in which things have changed in our society over time as they related to race, it's occurred in fits and starts. And I'm not talking about 2 steps forward and 1 step back. When we look at those moments, those periods where we've had major breakthroughs, those periods are short-lived. And then what follows is not a backlash. What follows is an attempted course correction. Saying that the America that we're driving and striving to create is not the America that was intended when the founders created it. Fits and starts. Perpetual racial progress. We're burdened by that. Think as though things are always going to get better. So we're here. We find ourselves in a familiar place. Familiar in so many different ways, especially as they relate to the federal government. You know, when the recent Supreme Court passed the Dobbs decision, rolling back reproductive freedoms of women, the past Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi gave a very impassioned and powerful speech on the steps of the nation's capital. And I was listening to her, and I was appreciating what she said. And then at one time in this speech, she says, never before in American history have rights been given and then taken away. And I wanted to raise my hand. Madam Speaker, like that's the entirety of the African American experience. Fighting to secure basic civil rights and human rights and then having them rolled back. No right is guaranteed to exist forever. That's the place where we find ourselves, fighting to maintain, fighting to hold the line, not just fighting to expand. And we've been here before. We've been here before. So, if we've been here before, what lessons from the past can we draw going into the future? Well, the theme, drawing on Dr. King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here?, offers us some guidance. The full title of that volume, and I encourage those who haven't had a chance to read it, everyone to read it, is Where Do We Go From Here? ? Chaos or community. This is written in 1967 into 1968. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? The most recent administration just took office a week ago. That week has been the longest year in my life. We are experiencing chaos in real time. That's the point of the project, to create chaos. You will hear people talking about flooding the zone. That's the point of the project, to sow chaos, because they are not interested in building community. In fact, we have to be clear about this, and many were warning about this going into the election. If you elect this person, be clear about what's going to happen. Going into this election, we were no longer disputing and debating policies. Those were the good old days when we could debate policy. This was not an election about debating policy. The GOP, those right-wingers, they are not interested in policy. They're not interested in democracy. They don't view democracy as something that should be protected. They view democracy as the problem, as something that should be destroyed. This is not hyperbole. We've had a week and 3 days of efforts to destroy democracy. And we've been building towards it. This is not a Trump phenomenon. This is not a Trump phenomenon. Government is the problem, is not a Trump creation. We go back to 1980, Ronald Reagan, running for president of the United States. Government is not the solution, government is the problem. So 40 years later, what are they trying to do but to break government? Now for us, for those who believe in democracy, those who believe in freedom, but especially for black folk, we have always needed government, federal government in particular, on our side. Doesn't mean they've always been there. It took almost a century to get the federal government to figure out they need to end slavery. Haven't always been there. But we've needed government as an ally. And so when you're trying to break government, when you're trying to break the enforcement power of government, then we suffer. Then we suffer. We have people in power who are interested in chaos and not community. They're anti-everything. Anti-CRT, anti-DEI, anti-gay, anti-trans, anti-democracy. They actually don't stand for anything. They are anti-us. So we have to be clear in this moment, if we were not clear before, what it is that we are up against. And what they're trying to do and trying to roll back all of these protections will absolutely have a detrimental effect on your lives going forward. Whether you are a student or you are in the community. Whether you are a citizen or you are undocumented. Whether you are straight or you are gay. Whether you are black or whether you are white. Whether you are a man or a woman. Believe me, it will impact you. So the question then becomes, what do we do in this moment? What do we do? There are folk who, and I probably spend a little bit too much time on social media. I need to get off the damn thing. But sometimes it's fun. People have been saying in the last few days, where's the opposition party? Where have the Democrats been? Where's the Democratic plan? They had a plan. It was called Vote for Kamala Harris. You didn't execute the plan. What are you talking about? This isn't a defense of the Democratic Party. They can defend themselves. They got more money than me. They laid out clear. We saw clearly what the issues were. We wouldn't have to deal with this. We had to deal with other things. We wouldn't have to deal with this if we would have executed on that plan, but we didn't. Lots of reasons why we came up short. But we didn't. So the question now is, how do we build community? How do we salvage community? First thing, we got to be clear and be prepared for what's coming. That means we need to brace for impact and figure out immediately what we need to do when the rug starts being pulled out from under us. They say, well, we dodged the bullet today with the federal government having put in that freeze on grants and loans. So if you think you're safe, you're wrong. Because they didn't rescind the desire, they didn't rescind the executive order, they just rescinded the memo of execution. So we're nowhere near clear of what's coming. So in this moment, how do we rebuild? How do we hold the line and how do we build? It's not by looking towards a political party. Especially not the Democrats right now, because they're not the ones in power at the federal level. They don't control a single branch of office. So if we're sitting here saying, okay, do your thing, ain't much they can do. There's not much they can do. So do we just throw our hands up and move on? No. I would submit that history tells us we probably never should have been looking towards elected officials to save us in the first place. We're the ones who have to push our elected officials. One of the critiques that we have to have coming out of the civil rights movement is, did we overinvest in electoral politics? You have to have people in office who are beholden to you, but you have to have people on the outside who are organized and willing to put pressure on those folk. That's whether they are friend or foe. There are elections, not just in 4 years, there's elections every year. So we have to stay engaged in electoral politics to be sure. But it's time to organize. And not just, and we have to organize in those sort of national ways and become a part of the national organizations that are engaged in protests, and we'll see the marches and demonstrations. Those are coming soon. Be a part of the ACLU and the NAACP and support those organizations. That's important. But the organizing I'm talking about now, the holding the line that we have to do, that you all have to do, is deeply personal. It's at your jobs. Companies and corporations that are rolling back diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. If you're working at that job, or your parent is working at that job, or your friend is working at that job, they need to say no. It's at our schools and universities that are doing away with DEI offices. No. That's where we can stand up. That's where we can say something. The conversations we have with our friends who are saying, oh, just let time pass. Things will get better. Time is not a social force capable of creating change. It's just a unit of measure. It's in our hands now. Nobody's coming to save us. If we want to get out of this mess, then we got to figure out, what can we do to hold the line? What can we do to say, no, you are not going to take my neighbor away. You are not going to come into my class and take my student away. For the last 25 years, I've been teaching African American history, and I teach the early part of African American history. And we talk about the resistance of our people, enslaved people, to the institution of slavery. And in the last 20-some years, I've been teaching in Ohio, and Ohio was obsessed with the Underground Railroad. All these kids come into class knowing about the Underground Railroad. And I always ask them, who would be a conductor on the Underground Railroad? And all these kids raise their hand. All these white kids. Oh, I'd have been a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Well, now's your chance. Now is your chance to stand on the right side of history. And there's no expectation that we're all going to be on the front lines of this struggle. But the front lines are everywhere now. They're everywhere in our lives. The stores you choose to shop in. The sports organizations you choose to support. The family members and friends whose homes you choose to go to. The front line is everywhere. There is no excuse for not doing anything. You have to do something. Dr. King, in the speech that he gave at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, March of 1965, he talks about the arc of the moral universe. He says the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We've heard that. And that provides a degree of comfort. If the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice, well, inevitably we'll get there. That sounds a whole lot like that perpetual racial progress myth. Because Dr. King actually said something more than that. He said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice only if you have people who are willing to exert the force necessary to bend it in that direction. He didn't say only if you have elected officials. He said only if you have people, the same people that Langston Hughes was talking about nearly a century ago, the same people that Frederick Douglass was talking about a century before that, willing to put their lives on the line, willing to be sacrificed to bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice. And if we don't commit to doing that in any way, not the way that I say, not the way that Dr. King says, but the way that you feel is necessary, the way that you can in your sphere of influence. If we don't do that, then the arc will continue to bend in the direction that it's going, and that's not towards justice. It will continue to bend in that direction. The last lesson I'll share, and this comes from studying the civil rights movement, studying at the feet of Dr. Crawford about what the civil rights movement was all about, is that when I ask my students sometimes at The Ohio State University, national football champions, when I ask them about the civil rights, movement, and I say, well, how many people participate in the movement? I'm teaching a class this semester on the civil rights movement, beginning of class. How many people participate in the civil rights movement? And there's always some kid speaking for the majority will raise their hand. This kid raises their hand in this class this year. How many people in the civil rights movement? Raising, yes, sir. Everybody. Everybody was in the civil rights movement? Everybody was in the civil rights movement. We have this idea, this mistaken notion that just masses, the majority, if not everybody, then the majority of people on the front lines of the movement fighting for freedom. We want to look back and always be on the right side of history. We want to put grandma and grandpa on the right side of history. The vast majority of people were sitting on the sidelines, often for very good reasons. It was dangerous to be fighting for freedom. I understand that. I'm not saying I would have been there. I'm just saying that the vast majority of people were on the sidelines. But the lesson that we should take away from that is that that movement, particularly in the 50s, 60s, and into the 1970s, transformed America in ways that were inconceivable for generations before and even feels inconceivable now. Transformed America. And it wasn't everybody. It wasn't the majority. It was a small number of people. The takeaway, even in the moment that we find ourselves in, back in this place that Langston Hughes was talking about, is that it won't take a lot of people to get us out of here. It will not take a lot of people to get us out of here. It just takes a handful of folk who are committed and dedicated to freedom, to justice, to humanity, to democracy. And we will find our way out of this place. Thank you very much.
Again, my name is David Wall-Rice. I'm a professor of psychology here at Morehouse College, and Dr. Jeffries is like a big brother. I graduated in '95, so of course he went before and set the example. I want to ask you a few questions here, be in conversation a little bit about so much that you've shared with us, and then open it up to questions from the audience. I want to interrogate the assumptions just a little bit around this idea that we are here because we never left, right? And you opened the door just a little bit. We're at Morehouse College, Spelman College, Clark Atlanta University. We're in this space, and we look pretty comfortable. We had Barack Obama for 2 terms, Kamala Harris, sister vice president. We figuratively and literally have a brother who's a minority head of the U.S. House of Representatives. We got you at The Ohio State. We have brothers like Jeffrey Ogbar, who at the University of Connecticut. We've got Eddie Glaude, who are at Princeton. And we have people in these places, and certainly we did not have that back then. So hasn't there been some type of progress? Are we in the same place that we really were, where Langston Hughes is talking about 89 years ago?
So absolutely there's been progress. There's been substantial progress, there's been substantial change, significant and real gains. But I would argue that what undergirds the society, the fundamentals of society, has not changed. So in other words, race is not real. Race is biologically meaningless, but it's socially meaningful. You understand this, you know this. And because it's socially meaningful, it's flexible. So, especially when we think about our individuals, people say, well, like I hear what you're saying about Barack Obama, and I hear what you're saying about the other candidates and not being racist enough, but still they voted for Barack Obama. It's like, yeah, genuinely appreciated Barack Obama. If you go back to 2008, Barack Obama spent $750 million, $750 million to convince white Americans to see him as a black man, yes, but as a black man separate from the black community. You go back in 08 and 2012, and you will not see a single picture, or not many, of Barack Obama holding a rally in the black community. Not in Detroit, not in Harlem, not in Atlanta. He sent Michelle, and we understood what was happening, but not him. Why? Because his election absolutely represents progress. However, when we think about white supremacy and manifested in sort of racism, we're at that stage now where white Americans can idealize an individual of color, can truly appreciate them and their talents, and still hold all these negative stereotypes about the people they don't know, about the community as a whole. And it shouldn't be surprised that we did it with elected officials, because we've been doing it with actors and entertainers. Singling out Oprah Winfrey, singling out Michael Jordan, singling out LeBron James. You got Klan members in Louisiana with posters of LeBron James, right? That's their guy. But they can still hold those racist stereotypes about the group that then inform their political decisions.
So then how do we disrupt that? I want to talk kind of locally. You talked about how it is that it's important for us to build community, to brace for impact. Let's talk about being at a Morehouse College, at a Spelman College, at a Clark Atlanta, being in the Atlanta University Center. What are things that the student scholar here would be called to do in developing or creating community and in pushing for this notion of America, realizing this notion? And not only the student scholars, but the academics who are charged to shepherd them. What is my responsibility? Dean Jackson and Dr. Crawford, Dr. Adams, what are our responsibilities in working with these students as well?
I think it's important that students realize and recognize, just as we were once students as well, both undergraduate and moving through graduate school, that being in college and being at a place like Morehouse and Spelman and Clark, being in the AUC in particular, is a privilege that most folk do not have. and will never have. And not just a privilege in terms of just coming to socialize and hang out and have a good time, and you can have that, but it's a privilege to be in this space where you can think about these ideas. You can learn about these constructions. You can learn about the sort of blueprints that have worked in the past and the things that we need to do moving into the future that you will not have anyplace else. And you will not have time to do this anyplace else. The reason why the privilege of being here is that you're afforded the time as well as the space and the encouragement and the prodding to figure this mess out. That's deep in the roots of what it means to be at an HBCU. That's deep in the tradition of what it means to be an African American or person of color teaching, not just at an HBCU, but in classes coming out of that black academic tradition. We don't have the luxury of just thinking about ourselves. We don't. You can try. And individually, you're coming out of here, you have these great educations, and you can succeed individually, but at some point, it's going to smack you in the face. And you'll have that realization like, damn, I am a part of a community. And as my community goes, so go I. And this is the time in this space, there's no other space like it, that you get that chance to dig deep and try to figure some of this stuff out. You won't get all the answers, but this is the time where you're charged with the task of thinking about it.
So I appreciate you saying we don't have the luxury to just concentrate or think about ourselves, but that's what we're trained to do in this democratic space, right? Or in this capitalistic society, this idea of rugged individualism. And we see examples, especially in popular culture, of black exceptionalism. And we see, okay, well, they're doing well and they can perform at Trump's inaugural event and this kind of stuff, and they seem to be okay and still say that they're connected to the black community. I'm curious if there is any connection then with this idea of not having the luxury. Is that in some way connected to King's idea of a courage to love? This idea of, I told you kind of before we stepped up on stage, I was prepping for class and listening to an old conversation between John Powell and Bell Hooks, God bless, right? And one of the things that Bell Hooks was talking about when she was talking about this idea of the beloved community, right, is that the love of community and the love of relationship, and I'm, again, trying to locate this a little bit within our space here, the luxury or the responsibility, the privilege of being in this community charges us with a commitment to love and to be accountable to one another in that love.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and to talk about it in sort of frank and concrete terms.
Yeah.
And thinking about and reflecting back on my Morehouse days and some of my classmates, class of '94 who were here, it was hard to love Morehouse when we were here. It was hard to love Morehouse in real time, right? I appreciated the brothers and the conversations and the sisters and the teachers, but institutionally, it wasn't easy, right?
That is frank and real.
And it's really not until you leave, not until you get some distance and some separation, that you appreciate the community and the love that the institution had for you, even when it wasn't always clearing all the obstacles that you thought needed to be removed. It's hard to love in real time in that way. That comes with sort of, I think, age and wisdom, right? And you realize, like, man, that's such a unique place. It's such a unique opportunity. Now, I was too young at 17 and 18 and 19 to truly appreciate it. I've been in 2 communities, and this was the second one. But you still take it with you, right? You leave with some of it. Like, you never change. You spend the time here. You're never the same. You're changed. You may not realize that change until later in life. And you may not see that change just looking in the mirror, but you'll see it when you see your classmates. You see it in them. You see what they're doing. You see the impact they're having. You see the love that they have for others and the love that they have for you. And you realize that that was born while you were here. It's an especially hard thing to do, I think, for African Americans when the nation itself doesn't love us. So Langston Hughes was talking. He was like, man, like, the artists tell us that this place does not love us. Yeah. Tell me a time when it did. It may love some individuals and celebrate those, but does not love us. So you're asking me to love? I mean, that's the power. Look, when I was growing up, and you know, as a kid in Brooklyn, New York, I was more Malcolm than Martin. I couldn't stand Dr. King. I was like, what is this nonsense he's talking about? I'm living in the era of the crack wars and the rise of mass incarceration, and you talking about turn the other cheek and nonviolence, and all I'm seeing is violence on the streets? How does that even work? It doesn't compute. And so, of course, I chose to come to his alma mater.
Of course.
But it was down here that I realized that the king that I had been taught was not the king who actually lived. And so there was a moment where I was like, man, I felt bad. I was like, yeah, I wasn't high on king. I kind of felt bad and kind of kept that to myself. But then I realized that, no, man, you were right to reject the king that you were being taught, because that wasn't the king who actually lived. That wasn't the radical king. That was a king frozen on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And so over the last 2 decades, I've been trying to figure out not only, well, who was king, but what was his message, and this message of love. And I was like, damn, that is powerful. Yeah. Like I'm still trying to wrap my mind around the power of that. And I'm not there yet, because it's easier to hate. It's easier to be angry. Yeah. But it also can be paralyzing. So there's a lot that we can be upset about, and deservedly so. There's a lot of cussing that I do, and I try not to do too much in front of my daughters. And rightly so. But that just eats at us. It's not constructive. I mean, the power of what King was talking about in terms of love and sort of loving your enemies, like, nah, I don't want to love them. I don't want to love them. What James Lawson was teaching was like, no, if you do not embrace love of humanity, then that eats away at you. I'm not there yet. I'm striving for that. Yeah. But I can appreciate how radical that is to walk in the world like that. Yeah. To strive for that. Yeah. Yeah. But in the meantime, I'm still going to be a little mad.
I dig it. So I want to ask for individuals, if you have questions, there's a microphone up here if you'd like to start coming up and lining up for questions. One last question, because I could be here all night with you, for real. You started off your remarks tonight talking about to all of those who believe in freedom. And then in the midst of your remarks, you said to those who believe in true democracy. Can you tell us what those things are? Can you, because I think that so many folks kind of rhetorically talk about, well, I believe in freedom, or I believe in democracy. What is that, and is there accountability and work and love that are tethered to those constructs as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, when we think about freedom, you know, I like, as a historian, I go back in time, and freedom is actually the term that black folk have used most often, most frequently, most commonly, when talking about what it is that they've been fighting for, right? Whether a literal freedom from the chains of slavery, or afterward, giving meaning to freedom. This is why in the 1960s, we have freedom songs and a freedom movement and freedom schools and freedom newspapers, right? I mean, they're talking about freedom. So we have to almost get away from the term civil rights, because it's too narrowing. Civil rights are rights that are granted by government. We need those, right? The right to vote and these other, we need those kinds of freedoms, very tangible. But we also need those freedoms that are connected to human rights. Yeah. Those freedoms that all people are entitled to, simply by the air, simply because they breathe air. Call them human rights or God-given rights, whatever. It's those rights that we are equally entitled to that we have to fight for. There's nothing in the U.S. Constitution doesn't say anything about education. Doesn't say anything about health care. Doesn't say anything about housing. Those are all human rights that all people are entitled to. Dignity, the right to be your authentic self. Like, those are things that we have to be fighting for and should be striving for, striving to achieve. And so on the question of accountability, we have to have accountability. Accountability in our conversations and accountability in our interactions. In the classroom, as a teacher, when I walk into the classroom and I have my classes, I understand that there are students that I have to protect and there are students I have to correct. And so we can debate almost anything in my classes, but the one thing we will never debate is the right of a person or people to exist.
Right.
And so if I allow that conversation, if I allow a student in my class to question someone's right to exist, whether because of their religion or their gender identity or their sexuality, then I am not accountable. I am not upholding what it is that our people have been fighting for. And democracy becomes an extension of that. Democracy in the sense that this is the nation in which we live, and collectively as a group, as a nation, how do we want to make decisions? I come from the Ella Baker School of participatory democracy, and believing that everyday people have it within themselves to be able to make the decisions that affect their lives. And so we're also living in this moment where not everybody believes that. Not just everyday people, but people as a whole shouldn't have a say in the decisions that affect their lives. And so that democratic understanding isn't just exercised at the ballot box. It also must be exercised in our daily lives, in the decision-making that we do, whether we're talking about family decisions or work decisions. How are we involving the people in our community, however we're defining community, in making these collective decisions? And this last thing, that will be especially important in this moment. Especially important in this moment. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was sort of birthed by Ella Baker in large measure, they would make decisions by consensus. And they would have these legendary long meetings in Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana. I mean, going, 7, 8, 9 hours, trying to make a decision about, what are they going to do in this particular local movement. And the reason why those meetings would last for so long is because they were committed to this idea of participatory democracy, everybody be a part of it, but because they knew that they were asking everybody in that room to sacrifice, to potentially risk their life in the action that was coming forward, even if that was simply helping people come to register to vote or going canvassing, that they were asking people to put their lives on the line. And they said, we cannot ask people to do that and then not be willing to hear their voice in the collective decision that's being made. And so we have to be clear that the chaos that is ensuing, that we're walking into now, will be for some of us life and death. Life and death. Those are the stakes. And if those are the stakes, then we need to be clear. You just don't send people out there. It's not a military. We're not sending people out there to die. But if you're going to put your body on the line, if you are going to stand in front of an ICE officer, then the decision to do that has to be yours and can only be yours. And that is democracy. And then we extend that into the formal electoral sense. But it has to be something that we internalize.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening, Dr. Jeffries. My name is Noah Cathy. I'm a freshman, journalism major, political science minor on the pre-law track from Dallas. And I wanted to expound upon the last thing you talked about, especially with SNCC, but also with a lot of the conversation thus far, and in general, is largely philosophical, theoretical, like what progress looks like. But as a college student, it's admittedly difficult to think about the grand scheme of things when things feel so minute on a personal level. And so I wanted to ask you, about what you feel practical progress looks like, or what the signs of progress would be despite the trying times we're currently in.
Well, I think it's a great question. And so what are the markers of progress? I mean, we're making progress. Sometimes that progress gets rolled back, right? I mean, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is progress. The reauthorization of it in the 80s and in the 90s is progress. The undermining of it with Shelby versus Holder is not progress. It's rolling it back. The recent Trump administration sidelining, firing, getting rid of the Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department is not progress. It's rolling it back because now there's no enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. So what does progress look like in that context? Progress looks like getting the Justice Department, Civil Rights Division, up and running again. Progress looks like reauthorizing and coming up with a new formula for the Voting Rights Act. Now, what does it take to get that? Because none of that's happening. You're not getting the Civil Rights Division back in this administration. That's gone. So all those cases of racial discrimination, electoral fraud, that's gone. Nobody's going to be prosecuting that. So what does progress then look like? Well, we can't just think about the federal level now. This becomes local. So how are we going to hold our state legislatures accountable for the voting rights legislation that they're either implementing or trying to roll back? Georgia's been leading the way. Like with voter disenfranchisement. This is ground zero for voter disenfranchisement. The Justice Department is not coming to the rescue. So what does progress look like? Progress looks like a grassroots effort. We've seen some of it with Stacey Abrams. Grassroots effort, mobilizing, political education, getting folk to understand what it takes to get to the polls and understanding the obstacles that they're going to face. But that's just sort of that's still big picture, right? Progress also looks like, on the ground, right? If you're first year freshman now, journalism student, who knows if newspapers are even going to be around in a couple years? Who knows if those corporate media is going to be engaged in hiring, like programs to make sure that their news staffs are diverse. In this moment, a lot of our progress, I think, is actually holding the line, making sure those programs don't get rolled back, making sure that admissions to graduate programs are still targeting us. Like we're in a moment we're not going to really have a lot of gains. It's about holding what we've gained in the past and making sure we didn't lose it. Ohio State, in 2005, its black student population at Ohio State. And Ohio State is the largest university in the country, right? Some 70,000 students. Black student population at Ohio State was about 15%. 15%. After a series of anti-affirmative action laws that were passed, Supreme Court rulings that were coming out of Texas and Michigan in 2003, 2004, Ohio State changed its sort of admissions policies and practices, went to looking at first generation, economics, and all this other stuff. Within 10 years, the black population at Ohio State dropped from 15% to 5%. 15% to 5%. And that's when you could still consider race in graduate admissions. So in that sense, well, what's progress? Is it progress trying to get back up to 15? Hell, I'd be happy if we could keep it at 5 right now, in light of what the Supreme Court has ruled most recently. So progress, whether we're talking about big picture or local, is really relative to what has been accomplished and what's the environment that we find ourselves in. Are we in a position, are we posturing to hold the line, or are we in a moment where we can actually advance? Most of our history as African Americans has been about holding the line and not trying to lose the gains that we've had.
Let me ask this, brother. What's your name again?
Noah Cathy, sir.
Brother Cathy. So I'm curious. as you were talking again in your remarks, you talked about how we hate history and we love nostalgia. And I'm curious, given your major, the assumption is that you're going to go into journalism in some capacity. Is that true?
Well, the goal is to go to law school after that, but to
Okay.
combine storytelling.
Okay, great. So great. So I'm curious about how it is that Brother Kathy can right now, in the beginning of his time at Morehouse College, demonstrate that he does not hate history, but is a student and scholar of it, and how he might incorporate that into his profession and his practice years down the line.
If you're thinking about both journalism and law and the intersections of the two, as a historian, immediately two people come to mind. Ida B. Wells, as an activist journalist. We're in this era of new media and fake news and all this other stuff. We need truth tellers who are going to point out the reality, not just of the past, but of the present and what's happening and the meaning and significance. Part of the reason why we're in this situation is because media failed us, not calling out disinformation and misinformation, right? So there are models in the past. Black newspapers were so critically important. The black news media is so critically important to keeping our eyes on the prize, if you will. So thinking about those models, not being running from history, but confronting it head on. And then you cross-section that with somebody like Charles Hamilton Houston. We all know Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was the first black Supreme Court justice, but Charles Hamilton Houston was his mentor, was his teacher, was the dean of Howard University Law School, turned Howard University Law School into the mecca of producing black lawyers. And he had a saying, a charge that he said to his students while he was the dean in the late 20s, early 30s, before he creates or spearheads the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He said, if you are going to be a lawyer, you need to be a constitutional lawyer. You need to use the law to change society. And he said, if you are going to be that, then you are either going to be a social engineer committed to creating a more democratic society, or you are going to be a parasite. Wow. You're either a social engineer committed to democracy, committed to using the Constitution and law to help society, or you are a parasite on society. And he's telling that to black young men and women who are pursuing law. And so my charge to you and to anyone else, it's the same thing I say to my students when they say, what do you want to be? I want to be a lawyer. You want to be a social engineer? You want to be a parasite?
Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Isaiah Zimba. I'm a junior business administration major with a concentration in finance. And as we all play our part to uproot institutions that affects us, my question is, how do we discern between those that will either help advance the movement or those that were implanted by either the government or self-imposed that's going to hinder progression?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's a question I think that we have to take seriously, right? What's the role of the institutions in our lives? And those roles change. And so being knowledgeable about the conditions that we find ourselves in the moment helps inform our understanding of the role that that particular institution can play. We saw within the last, that first Trump administration, we were like, and I certainly wasn't the only one, found myself cheering for the FBI. Like, how did that happen, right? And so now, it's the good old times again, right? With this new FBI that's coming up. The institution changed as the situation and circumstances changed. So I think we look at everything sort of in the moment, taking into deep consideration sort of the long history. History informs the present, but not dismissing. We're in a period where we have to be searching for allies. And this isn't just about sort of individuals. We can all just fight as individuals. We're going up against these oligarchs. I mean, we're going up against corporate America that is lining up behind this person. We are going to need institutions behind us. We are going to need organizations behind us. We are going to need nations behind us. And we can't go into that blindly. We can't go in knowing everything that they may or may not do. All we can do is prepare ourselves to go into it. Stokely Carmichael talked about coalition. Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. And he talked about black power. And he said black power meant African Americans, black folk in those places where they were a numerical majority, organizing themselves so that they could then enter into coalition from a position of strength. And I think that's sort of what you're asking, or at least that's what I hear you're asking. It's like, okay, we gotta incorporate coalition, we gotta build coalition, we gotta build some of our own institutions, strengthen some institutions that are here, but we also gotta work with existing institutions. We don't want to go into those blindly. We don't want to go into those relationships blindly. But we also have to realize that we cannot do this on our own. We cannot survive on our own, and we cannot save this place on our own. So thinking about the past and applying it to the present.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening, Dr. Jeffries. How are you?
Good, man.
Good, good. My question is, part of the Trump administration's striking down of DEI included an advancement of the notion of meritocracy. Right. The notion that theoretically the cream will rise to the top, pun intended. That being the case, I can see, and you're right, we have been here before, where you mentioned it before at Ohio State. You talked about the University of UCLA Law School saw their population of black students drop. University of Texas, any number of them. That being the case, our students, our schools have to welcome our students back. So what do you see as the role of the HBCU and black leadership organizations like the Black Greek Letter organizations and so what? How do you see them serving our students and unifying African Americans?
Well, one of my graduate students who now teaches at the University of North Carolina, Jelani Favors, wrote a wonderful book on the role of black colleges, and he titled that book Shelter in a Time of Storm. And that's what our HBCUs have always been. Shelters in a time of storm. We find ourselves back in the heart of a storm. Right. And these universities have always been incubators of those who will fight for freedom and those who will fight for justice, and that role will continue to be. We also have to be well aware that of our the precarious financial situation that we have always found ourselves in, right, especially as it relates to funding from the federal government. And so you talk about, so our fraternities and organizations and the communities, we are going to have to step up now in ways that we haven't before to make sure that these shelters remain open for those who need that cover in the midst of this storm. There's going to be a lot for all of us to do. But we need our Morehouses, we need our Spelmans, we need our Clarks. We need them. We cannot do this without them. But they've always been there, right? They shepherded us from slavery into freedom. Thank you.
Thank you.
As President Franklin comes up, I can't help myself here. President Franklin, I'm going to put you on the spot just a little bit. Before you ask a question, can you give us some examples that our scholars sitting here might pay particular attention to with respect to Dr. Jeffries in the context of ethical leadership? What are some of the characteristics that he exemplifies that we would do well to emulate?
Thank you, Professor Rice, and welcome back home, Dr. Jeffries. On this question of moral leadership, of course, Morehouse and the HBCUs have promoted traditions that argued that moral leaders are people of integrity, of courage, of imagination, who serve the larger public good, serve everyone, and while also inviting others to join the movement. And so that would be the shorthand version of my understanding, and the faculty of this college and of the Atlanta University Center, I think, have tried to advance that work and the work you've done. I wanted to be here this evening to pay tribute to Dr. Vicki Crawford, who has led this work and kept alive this treasure of the Martin Luther King Papers, to Dean Jackson and others who support this work. In 1983, there was a conference on Capitol Hill This is during the time when President Ronald Reagan, a Republican president, signed into law the Martin Luther King holiday. I know you all know this or have heard it, but keep this in mind. 1983. We never hear about this gathering of scholars and black leaders on Capitol Hill in 1983 prior to that signing. Coretta Scott King was there, Claiborne Carson, the historian, Vincent Harding, Alden Morris, all those folks. Doing the math, you were probably in elementary school if you graduated from Morehouse in '94. But the point I wanted to make, it was only 3 years later before it was celebrated as a national holiday, 1986, so we should all know that. I'm intrigued, 2 quick questions, that President Trump has announced that he's going to open the files on the King-Kennedy assassinations. Do you know what we're likely to learn that we don't already know? Because I know that many recent biographers, Jonathan Eig and others, have explored the FBI, some FBI files, but there's more, I know. So that's one question. And then the second, at a time of urgency, and that's part of what I heard you talking to us tonight about, the urgency of now, quoting Dr. King. Do you agree with Vincent Harding, the historian, who said, in times of crisis, our people need to begin to convene summit meetings? Summit meetings of leaders, and some folk might talk about that as, you know, all HBCU graduates and others ought to be a part of organizations that are going to help protect, hold the line, as you were saying a moment ago. But Harding suggested summit leaders need to come together in summits to strategize these next few years particularly. And I'm wondering if you perceive any energy for that kind of gathering. I think our SGA president here ought to be a part of all SGA presidents and HBCUs coming together. And then beyond that, but whatever organization you're in, everyone needs to bring together their best and brightest and mobilize, staying connected to the grassroots, as Malcolm would urge, so that we can prepare for the culture war ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the questions, but most importantly for your leadership as well as your presence here. And I echo those sentiments about Dr. Crawford for sure. You're spot on, and Vincent Harding, I mean, I'm so glad you called his name. There is a river. And he was spot on in this idea of the importance of black folk coming together during these times of urgent crises. I mean, there's a long tradition of that, going back to the antebellum era and the conventions, the black convention movement. You're talking about during a time of slavery. If black folk can come together during a time of slavery, we can figure out how times to come together now and deal with the issues that we're dealing with. And those were meaningful meetings held out, obviously not in the Deep South, but you know, they're holding them in New York and in Philadelphia and the like, and they're trying to figure out how can we get free? How do we strategize? How do we hold on to the basic civil rights that some of us have obtained as free blacks outside the South? And that tradition continued on. We see conventions and the like being held among African Americans throughout the Jim Crow era. And it's important, and it wasn't grandstanding. It wasn't to get likes. It wasn't to get your name in the press. It was to strategize, to stay connected, to draw and pull resources. And so I love the idea, and I would add to it that taking a lesson from Ella Baker, it has to be intergenerational. As you were saying, with the SGA presidents or not, it has to involve young folk, right? And so drawing on the wisdom of the elders and the energy of the youth, that will be key to help us weather this storm. And then with you laid out, even ever so briefly, the moral and ethical leadership is critical now. One of the questions I hear all the time is, well, how come we just can't do what the Republicans do? I said, it's because Republicans lie. And if we're not careful, like we could do that. Yeah. We could just pretend the truth isn't real. We could just lie about everything that we do. But then, and suppose we are able to regain power. Now we've established this model and this custom of lying. I don't care if you're a right-leaning autocrat or a left-leaning autocrat. If you're an autocrat, You're not for the people. And so we have to be very careful that we don't model what we see out there now, despite its success, because it's not based on a moral ethic code, and that's part of the problem. It makes it more challenging, it makes it more difficult for us, but it is what we have to do. Because when we do take power and we do make this place a little better, we have to be in position to lead in the ways that you described. Thank you again.
Anything on the King papers?
Oh, I wish I knew. I wish I knew. I keep asking my brother. He says I don't have the clearance.
How you doing, Dr. Jeffries? My name is Freddie Golden. I'm a junior computer science major from Chicago. My main question would just be about education in a sense of nowadays, like a lot of things that is rooted in like the problems that we have is because of lack of education, whether that's through the youth, whether that's through false information. I feel like a lot of our root problems, especially in the black community, is lack of education. And I feel like a distraction or something that comes up like a lot is the entertainment factor of like the world like coinciding against the education factor. And what I mean by that is people are seeking education or want to know the right things, but they're so distracted by media and false advertisement and false things and things like that. So my question to you would just be like, as a young person and as an advocate, as all of us are in this room, how do you shift the focus from entertainment and distractions into more education and empowerment as a young black person in America?
Do you have some thoughts on that?
I'm gonna let you go first.
Oh, man. You know, when you talk about education, and the way you described it, I think about education as sort of I distinguish education from knowledge. But you can think about education sort of a formal apparatus of sort of going through school. But what I heard you describing sort of the pursuit of is the pursuit of knowledge, like knowledge and understanding. Rappers used to talk about in the 80s, and like pursuit of knowledge and understanding, knowledge and understanding, knowledge and understanding. And we need that. Like we need that knowledge and understanding in the midst of the onslaught of disinformation and misinformation in this era. I do not envy you being your generation, and what you are constantly being bombarded with in ways that are unprecedented. Like I don't think we fully appreciate the way in which sort of knowledge and information is being manipulated through algorithms and the like. And so you have to sift through all of that. So media literacy has always been important. But media literacy for me in the 1980s was, not just reading the New York Times. It was reading the New York Times as a kid and my dad saying, hey, you also got to read the Amsterdam News. Like read the black newspaper, read Emerge too. Here's a copy of Jet. Don't focus on the beauty of the week. Like read The Substance. Like that was it. It was 3 things. But media literacy for your generation, for you all, it's like a million different things. How do you cipher through all of the madness? Like that's really challenging. And it's important to do. It's not impossible, right? But it's pausing. The question, and I do this as a historian all the time, the question that you have to do all the time as you're surfing the web and doing all that stuff is, what's the source? Mm-hmm. What's the source? Right? This is interesting. This sounds, what is the source? And you got to backtrack. You got to trace it. If you don't know the source, if it's not a credible and reliable source, if the source is unidentifiable, then step back. The fact checking has to be done by us. Part of what the challenge was in this last election, it wasn't the messaging of the Democratic Party. If you go back and look at the messaging, there's very little that they'll say that I think anybody in this room would disagree with, that most people would disagree. It's that the messaging wasn't getting out there in this flood of disinformation and misinformation. So how do you break through that? It's hard because it's not an even playing field. It's not a fair playing field. So we're asking a lot of individuals, especially in the small amounts of time that we're offering information. So I would say media literacy is critical. It's something that we need to be teaching in school, not just in college. We need to be teaching it K through 12. How do people receive information? How do people analyze and understand that information? Constantly looking for sources and fact checking. And then finding reliable resources and then sharing that with others. And then becoming real sources of information yourself. That's also the beauty of what we can do now. Right? We're more connected than we have ever been. We also have more knowledge in our access to more knowledge than any other people in the history of humanity. How are we walking around with blinders on? There's nothing that you can't figure out and fact check. Like within minutes, with the phone in your pocket. So the entertainment aspect of it is critical. And I don't necessarily blame, this is not a blame game on young people because they're sort of, engaged in entertainment. It's like everybody is. Like we're sold that. That's the drug that we get high off of.
That's it.
So at what point do we say, you know what? The situation is too serious. I got to unplug. I don't care what the Kardashians are doing right now. Right? That's nonsense. It's a distraction. It's as much as a distraction as some of the nonsense that they're doing in the White House. And I got to focus in on what really matters. What's the impact? And it's not easy, but it has to be done.
And I'm curious on recognizing also what it is that we're trained to do with respect to media. What are the baubles and trinkets that are being given to us to distract us from a thing? You took me back to the 90s when you talked about knowledge, wisdom. And I think of knowledge, wisdom, and understanding, poor righteous teachers, brand newbie, and all this kind of stuff. We know the 5%ers and whatnot. But this idea of being a critical consumer of information, right? And a critical consumer of literature, not and looking at media in a complicated way. We have a media list that is attached to Crown Forum, right? I get criticized all the time that it's too many entries. But if you look at your Crown Forum syllabus, there's a literacy list that has books that you should read, primary sources, that have lectures that are given that you can get on the internet, and albums that are important, ranging from Love Supreme to AT Aliens, right? And I think being able to look at those things and to be able to start there, because we are in a space, you're in a space, right? Not the luxury, but the privilege of being here to figure things out for 4 years. Respect and understand the authorities who are in front of you, interrogate them and make sure they're making good sense. But the hope and prayer is that we have scholars who are teaching you who can point you in the right direction. Sociologists, historians, biologists, chemists, psychologists. So looking and being bold enough to not be, and I hesitate to say this a little bit, but not being a lazy thinker, not being lazy, getting up and being self-directed and looking at those things that are put in front of you, right? And really, again, resisting this idea of being trained to just be a cog in the wheel of capitalism, right? How is it that you're going to achieve and attach yourself to knowledge, wisdom, understanding toward the pursuit of freedom, true democracy, and liberation?
Thank you. Thank both of you.
Good evening. My name is Raymond White. I'm a Ph.D. in City and Regional Planning from Georgia Tech. I was educated at Rutgers University. I've been in the Atlanta area about 40 some odd years and was the director of planning for the DeKalb County government for 13 years there, and economic development for 8 years. My question is one that relates to an observation that I had when I was working on my dissertation. My advisor told me to go to the Federal Reserve Bank, or gave me an opportunity. He said, go to the Federal Reserve Bank, and you'll hear a presentation that might be of interest to you. So I did. That was about 2012. And when I went there, it's sort of like the spook who sat by the door. I was one of few black people there. Some researchers out of California presented their work, which is based largely in Europe. And they were looking and sat down and interviewed people who were randomly in the street, young people, and asked them, and this is like in England, and asked them, so how many children do you plan to have? And so invariably they would say like 1 or 2 or none. And when asked the question of why, he said, well, I came from a big family. It looks like It was really tough for us, and we want to have an easy way to go as opposed to have all these children to provide for. The net of it is that in asking all of these questions, and they went to several different countries, European countries, they found that, and extrapolating, that the Europeans were not replacing themselves. The death rate was high, the birth rate was low. Extrapolating, projecting forward, they didn't see they're going to have enough children to fill the jobs that were needed. At the very same time, immigration is coming from Africa and from the Middle East and the like, and they were fighting to keep, the Europeans were, their identity. We're French, we're Spanish, we're German, and when the immigrants would say, I am too, I had the generation here and my children were born here, they said, well, you're still not, and you're changing our culture. You're speaking your language, you want to dress the part, and so they're fighting in the streets at that time. At night, you would be encountered by skinheads and the like, and this was actually happening. Meanwhile, this is 2012, so I'm looking back at the States, and the border was not breached yet. There wasn't even a discussion in 2012, 2010, thereabouts. There might have been some murmuring about that, but we hadn't seen the large numbers of Latinos coming across the border. There was no Trump. And so while I was working here over time, I noticed that people, the general public, was not aware of it at all. They had no knowledge of any such thing happening. I was watching this unfold, and in planning and economic development, I'm working with people of all races, all income strata, in business development. Our people aren't there largely. And this is 2000, say, going forward to 4 years later. Well, let me back up. In the 1990s, I became director. So during that time, I'm interviewing a lot of people and helping them to build houses and subdivisions and all that. The bottom line is, we were not involved as much. I would bring our people into a room and talk with them about development options. They would say, thank you very much. And they were in their own industries, like car dealerships, things of that nature that they own. Eventually, some of them got into the development side of things. So my point is, in America, we were seeing the same kind of, the same kind of efforts made on the part of the Europeans who are fearing. They're in fear. They're in a state of fear in this country and in Europe, which means around the world. They have done what they did to get where they are, and they are basically looking at minorities essentially as it was extrapolating it by 2050, they would be a minority among minorities. It's just impossible for them to handle that. And the white male is falling apart, rightfully so, for the things that were done around the world. And they're concerned and scared. My point is, they're looking at us as a minority. We're not a minority. We're part of the majority in the world. My new wife and I were in Egypt recently. We are the people who settled civilization before everybody else.
Brother, help us with a question,
okay,
please.
The net of it is, how do you see us working together, essentially, with those people who are in a state of fear, and their reaction is such? The Asians, the Hispanics are coming across, they're looking for jobs. They're looking for opportunity. They'll talk to us, but they see us as basically a competitor in that regard. So they wouldn't have voted for Trump. Trump is not the issue in my view. It's not an issue. The issue is there's change afoot, and they can't do anything about it. An economist just today said that America is declining, and is in a state of decline. So they're fearing that they can't do anything about it, and that's why Trump is there. It could be anybody else in place other than Trump. He's a figurehead in front of them.
Give us the question one more time.
I heard a little bit of it. My question is, how do we see ourselves communicating with the people who are in a state of fear as they move forward? Because they're going to do exactly what they're doing now.
Thank you.
And that's the point.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. It's difficult to talk to people who are in a state of fear. It's a challenge, especially when especially when you have to figure out, especially when they're afraid of you.
Right.
I mean, fear and hate give us racism, right? I mean, fear and hate are bound up in racism. That's why racism is so powerful. Fear by itself is a powerful organizing tool. That's why you constantly have this drumming up of fear of the other and the creating of the other. I think you're absolutely right. For those who are consciously, deeply embedded in this white supremacist thing, whether it's in Europe or it's in here, they're talking about the great replacement and all this other stuff, they're clinging to this deep belief in white supremacy. They don't want to see it go away. Like, I get that. I have no interest in negotiation with them. But for the average white person who's falling into that, what are you afraid of? Right? I mean, they're leaning into their own internalized racism that has them with the fear of the other, that stereotype of the group that they cling to. Like, they could have friends and neighbors and family members who are not like them, who are other races and ethnic groups who are cool, but they're not making that leap to saying, oh, the people who we don't know are not cool, right? Or cool as well. So it's a challenge. But I think the answer in the conversation is, like, there's no bargaining with racism. Like, there's no yield there, right? That's questioning somebody's humanity. And it's like, all right, if that's the position that you're staking out, then what we're really talking about is just power. Because you have nothing to be afraid of. I mean, this is the message the craziest thing. It's like white folk running around here, oh, we're afraid of rapists and Mexicans and black folk. I mean, they're all for generations. Like, white folk been talking about how scared they are of black people. And it's like, really? If we were going to do something, we would have did it already. Right. So what are you afraid of? And yet, the most dangerous place for a black person to be has always been in the presence of white people. Like, the fear of the other is real, but it should be like, it's a rational fear that black people have. It's an irrational fear that white people have. Yeah. Students all the time at the Ohio State University, young co-eds, young girls, young women at Ohio State University. And they're like, oh, well, you shouldn't be afraid of black people. You should be afraid of the white frat boys. So the negotiation, the conversation that we have to have, I think, has to be on terms of humanity. And they have to meet us before we can meet them.
Well, in anticipating a more mass exodus, let's be mindful. I want to be mindful and respectful of the time. We're close to time. I know we're trying to end at 7 o'clock. So if we can take these last two questions. I noticed I mentioned knowledge, wisdom, understanding, and the 5 percenters, and Professor Livingston stood up, so we'll see. Please.
I'm Miriam Shafiq. I'm a junior at Kennesaw State University with a major in sociology and black studies and a minor in psychology. I am from Egypt, so going to that point. To me, I'm also Coptic Orthodox, so my whole life I've been part of the oppressed minority group and watching it, and I've been part of the activism group for a very long time. I've not only Martin Luther King, but Malcolm X, Grace Lee Boggs, Walter Rodney, all of these leaders that we see in front of us were inspirational to me as being a young activist. What do you tell young activists who feel a little defeated right now and feel hopeless with everything going on? How do we continue to fight, keep moving, keep momentum, and continue to connect with scholarly like yourselves and several professors and just bridge that between us and ask for their help and guidance with it and everything?
Yeah, thank you. That feeling is a natural reaction to what has occurred. That you should, like that isn't anything to feel bad of, like, oh, I should feel bad. Like, no, we should all feel bad right now. We took a major L.
It's healthy.
Right? It's healthy. It's a healthy, natural response to that type of loss. Like, that is real. And that's also a part of the process of sort of organizing. There often are more defeats than there are victories. All the people you named faced major defeats, right? Including losing their life, right? So, like, understanding that we're not going to win every battle and we're going to lose some really big ones, and you're going to have a visceral reaction to that. Like, there were folk who, and we were, myself included, after this election, you wind up grieving the loss. because of how much you've invested in the possibility and also knowing what's about to come. So that's a natural reaction. So we have to, some of the best advice I got coming out of this moment was from a colleague in the ACLU of Ohio, and he sent out a note, and he said, to everybody, I know we're grieving. I know we're in this process. And he said, take your time. So we all grieve in different ways, and we all grieve at different paces. Take your time. We'll be here when you're ready. The fight is not going anywhere, and you're not going to miss it, and we will need you, and the energy, and the enthusiasm, and the knowledge that you've gained in past experiences. And so when you feel ready to step back in, then it's time to go. That's also a lesson coming out of the movement, right? And then not knowing that you're not doing it by yourself, right? Moving in community, even that's just a handful of people, it's still a community. And they help you sort of move through that grieving process, almost 5 stages of grief, right? You get to that final stage of acceptance, all right, this is the situation, this is the reality, and then you want to move to a 6th stage, action. What can I do, right? It takes a while to get there, but we'll be here when you're ready.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Doc. Sam Livingston, Associate Professor of Africana Studies. I had a question, 2 closely related questions, be very brief. First has to do with how you constitute the we that you talked about and that Langston Hughes discussed. You know, if you're framing it within Dr. King's where do we go from here, he raises the question of the World House. But I see very little international focus in terms of, you know, not just the presentation, but really it's us. We are international, but when it comes to actually thinking about justice, we are extremely national. What are the dangers of that at this present moment, especially given Rwanda's reinvasion of Congo? And it's interesting that he took this opportunity to do this on Trump's watch, basically following Israel as well. So really just about that we, Dr. King and how he talked about that notion of the World House. How can we apply that today?
Well, thank you very much. It's good to see you.
Good to see you,
We have to have an expansive view of the we. We shouldn't just be talking about we, as you point out, so I'm agreeing with you, we in the context of African Americans, we in the context of people living in this nation. We have to see ourselves as part of a global community. We are a diasporic people. I mean, one of the beautiful things about the African American freedom struggle is that it has always had connections to folk beyond this nation's borders, because, as Du Bois says at the turn of the 20th century, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. It was a problem of the 19th and the 18th and the 17th century. It's the problem of the 21st century. It ain't going anywhere. The only way that we're going to get free is if we broadly defined, understand and work with one another. I have had real problems with those who want to, in this American context, sort of separate out, right? And say, oh, I'm the descendant of an enslaved person, and you're from the diaspora. You know, we saw this foolishness around Kamala Harris, right? It's pointless. It's meaningless, right? It's meant to divide. We have to see ourselves. Given we've got real differences and divisions, and as you pointed out, and issues that we have to work out that are reflections of a broader sort of international forces. But we have to understand how that comes about, how it plays out, and the harm that it does. And we have to see our fates linked. I think, Dr. King talked about that, the linked fates of all people. But we have to, within our community, we have to make sure that we recognize and understand that our fate is connected to the folk in the Caribbean, it's connected to folk on the continent, it's connected to the folk who have migrated and are in Europe. And we in America have always been at the forefront, not always in the right way, but always been at the forefront of thinking about things globally and thinking about a global struggle. One of the important lessons of the civil rights movement, right, was that you had African students in still colonized nations who were coming over to HBCUs, right? Kwame Nkrumah, to Lincoln and others, to Howard University, connecting with black students here and then going back, both sharing wisdom and knowledge, but then also gaining inspiration, right? And so when the decade of Africa, when those nations are getting free and we see that these leaders are like, oh man, These are graduates of HBCUs. So there's always been that important connection. And we have to do we have to do everything that we can to make sure that we strengthen those bonds and don't weaken those bonds.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we'll have Dr. Crawford come up, but brother Dr. Hasan Kwame Jeffries, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. Thank you for not leaving from whence you came here, being a graduate of the institution, and really thank you for extending that lineage of the fight for democracy and for freedom that we so know existed with King, but before him as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Jeffries.
Thank you very much.
I'm just going to say thank you again it's been a wonderful evening to both of you, Dr. Jeffries, Dr. Rice, insightful conversation. You called the names, you called Vincent Harding, you called Ella Baker, and I appreciate you calling out these names so we can know who these other folks were who were part of this movement. By the way, Dr. Harding taught a course here. I don't know if you know that, back in 2012, and so, that was an exciting time for us. But I want you to join me in thanking them, too. And I just appreciate everybody coming out, students and faculty from Morehouse, Spelman, Clark, Atlanta, I believe Kennesaw, all the schools in the Atlanta area. This has been wonderful, and thank you so much.